thank CCLA and London funders for giving me the opportunity to contribute to this fascinating series of debates, which does indeed allow ideas to be explored. I'm certainly going to explore one. It's just, giving me the opportunity to take something I've thought about on and off for a long time and to try and put the bones of an argument together, which I hope will convince you, but in the first instance to try to convince me. So here goes. Now, there's nothing to fear from a postcode lottery. That's what I agreed to talk about, and that's what I shall. And I want to begin by establishing that I think a postcode lottery is generally seen in Britain as shorthand for a failure of public services to treat people fairly and equally. It's become a major element in debate about public provision in the UK, though not necessarily in other countries. Wikipedia, which I wouldn't generally quote, but is actually rather a useful source for this kind of popular knowledge, states that, and I quote, "In the United Kingdom, the term postcode lottery refers to the way the allocation of postcodes, which often bears little relation to local government boundaries, can affect such things as insurance prices. The term is also used to refer to the way local budgets and decision-making can lead to different levels of public services in different places, especially with regard to health and social services, e.g. access to cancer drugs and the quality of education." I think most of us would recognise, particularly the second part, perhaps the bit about insurance we've also heard as well, is very important. Now, I want to stress in the United Kingdom in this definition. The concept of a postcode lottery is defined in Wikipedia as a British phenomenon, with no suggestion that, framed in this way, similar ideas are prevalent in other countries. We are dealing here with a very British concept, entirely commonplace in our press and in the broadcast media, but virtually unknown elsewhere. This is an important starting point, I think, for any discussion of why we should or should not fear the postcode lottery. If you want to test this, just use the time-honoured trick of the Google search engine, look at the New York Times' website, type in postcode lottery, and out comes something about a lottery in the Midwest where you can win prizes. That's what the postcode lottery is there. So it really doesn't exist if you look at other Anglophone countries. Now, interestingly, we the British are happy to tolerate very wide personal income and wealth differences. The Gini coefficient, an internationally recognised measure of the dispersion between incomes within a country, shows Britain with significantly wider income inequality than, say, Germany or France, or, predictably, the Scandinavian countries. This difference has persisted for many years, from which we must conclude that we, the people, like it that way. It may offend people in the audience, but frankly, if we didn't, we would vote into office politicians who would redistribute income sharply and change society. And the evidence of recent years is, for whatever reasons, we don't. But we do crave public services that treat people equally and which, to a significant extent, attempt to iron out the differences left by that range of income and wealth inequality suggested by the Gini coefficient. Indeed, we have come to expect schools to educate pupils in such a way as they will all have exactly the same life chances, for example, to go to university, and the NHS to ensure that everyone faces broadly the same rate of infant mortality and, in the longer term, of life expectancy. Schools, hospitals, and other public services have been set targets to deliver such desirable outcomes. Thus, we in this country have decided we are content with a wide range of income difference, but in parallel, we expect public services to equalise fully for the social and economic consequences of those wide differences. We also, compared to many countries in Europe, vote for relatively low tax burdens. So what we appear to want is Anglo-Saxon disposable incomes at a high level, but with European-style social policy. And this paradox, some would say blatant inconsistency, explains why British government spends so much time reforming and reorganising public services. The pressure to deliver comprehensive, equal services to all, but with insufficient power either to redistribute or to tax enough, has tended to leave politicians to set targets or to reorganise the NHS or to reorganise local government in a continuous attempt to make them perform this impossible task. But back to the postcode lottery. It's all relevant. I want to begin by making the strongest possible case against the existence of postcode lotteries in services such as schools, health, social housing, or policing. I'll restrict myself to public provision, though I accept that the debate on these issues has widened to, say, coverage of broadband between different parts of the country. There's very powerful expectation that if you live in the most remote part of the countryside, you should have absolutely the same access to broadband as if you live in the centre of a city, or even supermarkets. Some of those, our views are really confused about supermarkets. Sometimes we hate them, sometimes we like them, and sometimes we think they ought to be distributed relatively fairly so everybody has access to reasonably priced food. So even the private sector or regulated private sector is brought within the compass of this. But I want to stick particularly today with public services. Now, the first thing to note is there is little written down about the evils of the postcode lottery. Instead, there's an extensive assumption, which you can read very widely, that almost without a need for discussion, such a thing is inherently and always bad. The precise argument about why a postcode lottery is bad is simply taken for granted. So broadly, it is seen as common sense that a postcode lottery will always be a problem. And a few quotes from the Daily Mail, and not just the Daily Mail, but the Guardian, will make the point. These newspapers, plus many TV and radio programmes, take it as axiomatic that variations in access to services or to prescription drugs are simply wrong. Often politicians extend this view by arguing that any variation in public service outcome, as opposed to inputs, is also evidence of a postcode lottery. So here are a few I prepared earlier, again, easily found. So from the Daily Mail, cancer patients hit by NHS cancer postcode lottery. Postcode lottery for stroke patients. Prostate deaths, a postcode lottery with mortality rate 5 times in some areas compared with others. And then, just to show it's not only about the health service, a Christmas shopping postcode lottery, which obviously emerged last Christmas. That's from the Mail, but in the Guardian, women denied IVF on NHS by postcode lottery. Postcode lottery for mothers choosing birth hospitals, from the Guardian. Report finds stark evidence of healthcare postcode lottery. Postcode lottery in rape convictions getting worse. Postcode lottery for university entrance getting worse. So I think it's not just the Daily Mail, it's right across the media and into the broadcast media as well. So I think we can see from this that the whole idea is established and it's powerfully understood within the contemporary media narrative. But what's the case against the postcode lottery? The most compelling argument would be that once we have, as a nation, assented to the idea of universal and free public provision, so I should have said, let me get this right, this is the argument against having a postcode lottery. Let me just get it right. So I'm not yet taking the argument to the idea. It's against whether there should be postcode lotteries. The most compelling argument would be that once we have, as a nation, assented to the idea of universal and free public provision, it's morally unacceptable that any one individual or family or group is differently treated to any other. This would not be the case for private services or for consumer goods, but it must be so for certainly welfare-based public services. So, why should an individual who is ill, who will need schooling, be differently treated because they live in Gloucester rather than because they live in Newcastle upon Tyne? Everybody pays taxes according to the same rules, so why shouldn't everyone receive services in exactly the same way? Certainly, any variation in provision whereby people on lower incomes or who are less articulate were less well treated than those on higher incomes or who were more able to argue their case would, I think, be seen as unacceptable by pretty well almost all people in Britain. It's something that we would all agree on. Very, very difficult to find people who don't agree on that. Indeed, you could argue a British sense of fairness, which I accept is hard to measure, but nevertheless something of a character attribute and often discussed, alone would lead people to believe that differences of income, lifestyle or geography should not lead to different treatment when it comes to universal public services. Let me just try a test. Not exactly the Royal Institution Christmas lecture, but hey. Hands up anybody who thinks it would be acceptable for a child, an under 5-year-old, who lived on one side of a borough boundary to have less good access to under 5's provision than a child who lived on the other side of the boundary. Anybody thinks it would be reasonable for that to happen? 1. 2. Thank you. That's 2. Anybody thinks it'd be unreasonable? Overwhelmingly unreasonable, but we are a plural society, and thank you for those who voted the other way for showing that there is plurality here. But I make the point, overwhelmingly I think people think that accidents of birth where you live shouldn't affect access, particularly for those who don't directly have any say in the provision that they receive. Now, the origins of this way of thinking, at least in the context of British public institutions, can be traced back to early socialist thinkers, notably the Fabians, indeed doing the work in some cases at or near the London School of Economics. Sidney Webb, in his great study of local government, and it is a very long and great study, argued strongly for equalisation between rich and poor areas, and for minimum standards, and also for central government oversight of local councils. This thinking has influenced the allocation of grants to local government for much of the 20th century, and indeed came to influence the allocation of resources within the National Health Service. These are very powerful social democratic influences on the way resources have been allocated and indeed services have been overseen. The post-1945 welfare state, involving the creation of a National Health Service, following in education the lead of the 1944 Education Act, and the evolution after that time of personal social services, the development of mass social housing, each and altogether reinforced the idea that the state could provide decent services for all. People who had lived in want, as Beveridge called it, were raised to a position of decency, where no longer they had to worry about paying doctors' fees or living in grim rented housing, few of them living in grim rented housing. These improvements were paid almost exclusively by national taxation, creating a rational demand for national standards in those services. It was, after all, called a National Health Service. And once the whole country is paying taxes for national public services, it is surely logical that access to those services should indeed be the same everywhere. Of course, the welfare state has evolved enormously since, backed up increasingly by consumerism and, most recently, by a growing understanding of the application of human rights legislation. It is fair to say that people now see the NHS as more of an entitlement, supported by successive governments' belief that market power will drive improvement within the NHS. So our choices as consumers will, according to this theory, drive improvements in quality. We're right to act as consumers of health in this view of the world, which frankly the last government largely signed up to and the current one certainly does. Moreover, we now have rights to the best health provision in the world. It would surely be contrary to the highest international standards of human rights if an individual in one part of the country were differently treated to another person elsewhere. We are all equal under the law. Thus, what started in the late 1940s and before as an attempt broadly to ensure that people were free from want and that they could access an acceptable level of public services has become heavily suffused with consumerism, with rights, and demands that people everywhere should be treated in the same way. And these things mutually reinforce each other. It's easy to see how in this world, any variation in nationally provided services has come to be seen as an evil. Moreover, if we add to this the fact that 100% in effect now of all taxes are determined by central government, everything but council tax, and that is capped, then inevitably almost all the allocation of resources, certainly in England, is made from the centre of Whitehall. And if it's done like that, with central and national control, why indeed shouldn't all provision be equal, because it's all coming from one place?